Chicopee, Longmeadow, West Springfield, Belchertown, East Longmeadow, Ludlow, Northampton, Greenfield, and Wilbraham, as well as 29 Broad Street in Westfield. Bay State Dental makes it a priority to help you achieve and maintain the healthy smile you deserve. On the web at baystatedental.com.
We thank the generosity of our underwriters. For more information, please contact the Westfield State Foundation at 413-572-8646. Friday mornings is something different on 89.5 FM. It's JP's Talk About Town.
Community Radio.
89.5 WSKB. Live from the campus of Westfield State University, this is 89.5 FM WSKB Westfield.
Good morning, everyone. This is Mark Auerbach, and this is Arts Beat Radio for this Friday here in Western New England on 89.5 FM WSKB. Tomorrow is a major celebration in the world of music. It's the 100th birthday of Leonard Bernstein, and Tanglewood is ending its season with a huge Leonard Bernstein concert to commemorate this occasion. And it's being taped for broadcast later on PBS. But I thought, what a great opportunity it would be in celebrating one great musician to talk to two musicians who are currently making great strides in areas of music you wouldn't expect: classical music, film, theater, children's music, and they both have roots in Western New England. So we're going to be meeting Stephen Schoenberg in the first half hour of today's Arts Beat Radio, and Alexander Savronsky in the second half hour of today's Arts Beat Radio. Well, first, Stephen Schoenberg. For those of you who the name may sound familiar, he grew up in Longmeadow, Massachusetts, and he spent most of his life working in Western New England. He has a studio up on the Quabbin. He's done all kinds of music, from being a pianist to writing children's music to writing for Sesame Street. And one of his new projects happens very soon. He and Richard Michelson have collaborated on a musical, which is workshopping on Martha's Vineyard over Labor Day weekend. So good morning, Stephen.
Good morning, Mark. How are you?
I'm fine. It's always great to have a chance to chat with you. And we should probably just be transparent and tell our audience that we grew up around the corner from each other as kids. And both of us in our professional lives have been involved in the arts that kind of intersect in various places. But one of the first questions I had is, you started out as a pianist and really traveled all over the world performing in concert, in improvisational things. When did you start composing?
Well, the first part of my composition life was in songs. And I wrote my first song when I was 4 years old. It was to my mom. And the words were, "Mommy is a baby like a lady," and I played it over and over ad nauseum until it drove her crazy. It was really when I was, upset. And then the second song I wrote was when I was 11, and it was my aunt had asked me to put music to Edgar Allan Poe's Annabelle Lee. And then I just started getting into other types of music, and I was always in a rock band from the age of 10 until I graduated college. And, learned different styles of music, from classical to rock and roll and blues. And really, when I was in high school, I started serious composition, and I wrote a large choral piece. And then, went to a conservatory and majored in composition. And that was an interesting time because my music was not going in the path that music was in at that time, which was very atonal, very, Schoenberg and Boulez. And so it was difficult for me to get even grants because my music was fairly lyrical, tonal. I mean, it definitely had dissonance in it. And so when I realized I didn't want to go on to school to get a master's or a PhD just because of that reason, that's when I actually went into New York. You mentioned Sesame Street. I went into New York because I thought, well, I can write for characters. I've been writing songs, and I definitely wanted to write a musical. So I just got a job writing songs for Sesame Street, and I scored a lot of animations for kids television, and at that time did some commercial work, writing, scoring television commercials and radio commercials. And then I really just kept on writing classical music. I was composer in residence at that high school you mentioned, Long Meadow, for a couple of years, and I'm actually rewriting a piece right now for wind ensemble. My son, I think you know this, is a very established symphonic composer, and he had gotten a commission for wind ensemble, and they asked him if he had a piece for high school, and he said no, but my father, I think, does, and so I went and re-looked at it, and I realized, God, I wrote that when I was about 26 years old, and I can't believe I orchestrated it that way, so I'm really re-orchestrating it, and I'm going to send that off. But that takes a long time. I'm not a fast composer in that world. In the film world, I'm a pretty fast composer. It's a whole different way of writing. Does that answer your question, Mark?
Yeah. No, I actually have a question. When people score or write a score for a movie, what comes first? I mean, how do you know what to write? Do you talk with the director in advance and say, well, this is the mood and the tone that we want to come up with? Or have they already shot the movie and are you looking at stills or looking at video and then trying to compose to the action? How does it sort of happen?
Yeah, good question. Well, it happens along the way. So I will get a call to score a film, and it's never completed. I've never ever scored a film that was done, which is called scoring to the final cut. There's either sections, there's some cues that they've started to put together. They'll send me the script first. I'll read the script. And then I will meet with the director and the editor, usually, and sometimes even the producer. And then we'll sit down. I like to invite them to my studio, but that doesn't always happen. And we'll just talk about the flavor of it, what we think the sound should be, the orchestration should be. And if they're here in the studio, I'll just start improvising on the piano some themes. And eventually they will come here and we'll sit down and we'll do what's called, we'll spot the film. We'll decide which cues are to be scored. And at that point, it's in a really good, what's called rough cut version. So I'll do a piano version of it and send it off. And we'll just talk back and forth because really it's a collaboration and we just want it to be right. The hard thing so there's obviously, there's documentaries and then there's theatrical releases. I've scored a lot of documentaries and a couple of TV theatrical films and regular movie releases. Actually, the one I scored was also with my son Adam. But scoring for documentaries is really interesting because you can't editorialize. I mean, unless the documentary is absolutely one point of view, which is rare. A Michael Moore film is pretty much a one point of view, but so there's just different techniques, but I guess the answer is I see the film and come up with ideas, we talk about it, and then they sign off on a piano version, and then I go and orchestrate it for whatever the sound is. I mean, it could be for an orchestra, it could be for a small ensemble, and it could be for digital sampling sounds.
When you take the original composition and the music and you decide to orchestrate it, is it budget that a film budget that kind of directs how many musicians you can use? Is it your own creative? And you say, well, no, this really should have like violins versus flutes or something like that. What determines how it actually goes from composition to arrangement to actually being placed into the film?
Well, it's definitely budget. I mean, musicians have to be paid. It's a lot of times it's union, and there are very specific costs. We discuss that. You know, they may have a budget, but they may say, boy, I really want strings here and percussion here, and I will just give them the exact budget that those instruments, those musicians will cost. And so they have to figure that out. If they come with a set budget, then I really, at this point, know how many musicians I can use and, just to keep it within the budget of recording and paying the musicians.
Okay, when you're making, when you're scoring a movie or a documentary and whatever, and it comes to the actual point that it's been arranged and ready to go, I know your studio's in the Quabbin area. Where do you find your musicians, or do you record in New York or L.A. or something like that?
I record in New York or Boston, or there are studios in the valley that I record in. My studio that's in my barn is really just for composing, and I do have obviously monitors if I'm writing, if I'm scoring a film. But my studio is just a desk, and actually 3 desks, and a bunch of screens and a lot of music paper and pencil. I pretty much write with pencil and paper. I'm sort of old school.
And do you actually, as you see on television or something like that, do you actually compose at a piano, or can you be walking through a field and a melody comes to you? How do you record it and write it down?
Well, I definitely compose at the piano, but I can compose in the middle of a field. If I have an idea and I don't have anything with me, I remember it and then I'll write it down. But it's usually it's pretty set schedule. I'll just go into my studio and start writing. Sometimes I'll improvise on the piano to get some ideas, but yeah, basically it's in my studio. But if I'm traveling, it's anywhere really. I'll compose anywhere. And
you do the stuff for film and for documentary, but you're also doing theater work. And you've this piece that you and Richie Michelson are collaborating on, called Dear Edvard, is getting a concert on Martha's Vineyard over Labor Day weekend. When did you initially start working on that? And it's had various productions along the way. Has it changed from your initial collaboration to now, or is it an evolving work?
Well, musical theater is an evolving work until the contract is signed and you have a full production. But I started this in 2013 when I went to a reading. Michelson had a poetry reading, and I went to it. And I really felt his poems were musical, and he sent me some books, and there was a series of poems about the life and love of the artist Edvard Munch, and most people know Munch by the painting The Scream. And I just started writing a few songs, thinking this could be a nice song cycle. And after about the 3rd or 4th song, music that I put to his poetry, I thought, boy, this is very dramatic. And I asked a friend of ours who's actually a Broadway singer. She's in Come Far Away on Broadway.
Okay.
The musical. And I asked her if she would come, and her name's Pearl Sun, come and sing a few of the songs in the woman's voice, so that Rich didn't hear, or I didn't hear just my voice. She did, and just by chance, she had just performed Leonard Bernstein, who you mentioned, his Mass with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and they actually released the CD of that recently. And the stage director his name is Kevin Newberry, and Kevin Newberry is a very established, visionary opera director. He's done so many contemporary operas, Philip Glass's latest opera, Bel Canto, which was also filmed for Masterpiece Theater, The Revolution of Steve Jobs, which is happening, I think, in Santa Fe right now. Anyway, he heard the songs, and he wrote back and said, OMG, I love this. I want to direct it. And at which point my stomach sort of dropped, and I said, direct what? For me, at that point, I knew there was a drama in there, but, we hadn't written a lot of material. Maybe by that time it was 6 or 7 songs that I put music to Michelson's poetry. So we met with the director, and it pretty much evolved. We met with the director, and I came up with this really interesting opening, and from there we just started. Rich and I really started to collaborate at that point. We had to write new material. In our collaboration, he's always writing the poems first, and then he started learning how to write lyrics, and so we actually have some songs in there as well. But art songs are very different than musical theater songs, and I just happen to be able to take an art song and make it very theatrical. So it's just evolved. It worked out. We had a very successful reading. Mass Mocha gave us a 5-day workshop, and we really worked on it there. And then National Sawdust, which is a great place in Brooklyn, gave us a reading, and then it went on to Washington, D.C. at Arena Stage, gave us a reading. And now the real last reading that we're having is at the Martha's Vineyard Playhouse. And we're, discussing a full production with the theater right now.
So this is very much a work in progress. Has it evolved each time you do it? And get an audience response and see it being performed. Do you go right back to the studio and make a lot of revisions?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's been more. We've made a few editorial revisions of the songs that we've had. We took out, I think, 2 songs. We've added 5 new songs from the last reading. And this really is the last reading we'll have because we're ready for production. At this point, Kevin already has a vision of the piece, Kevin Newberry, the director, and I'm actually starting to orchestrate the piece itself. It's about an hour and 20 minutes long, and that obviously is just the music. So there's a lot of other stuff that will be composed to get from one place to the other as it's staged. But yeah, it's. I think it's pretty done at this point.
Okay.
We're having the last reading because we wrote 2 new songs, and we want to hear it and see it.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break and to acknowledge the underwriters here on Artsbeat Radio. We're talking with the composer Stephen Schoenberg, who is a Longmeadow native and Western Massachusetts based. This is Mark Auerbach with Peter Coles in the studio here at 89.5 FM WSKB, and you're listening to Artsbeat Radio. Don't go away.
Underwriting for community radio is provided by the YMCA of Greater Westfield. Every day, the YMCA strengthens the community through programs and services focused on youth development, healthy living, and social responsibility. For all the Y's many programs and services, visit us on the web at www.westfieldymca.org. The YMCA, 67 Court Street in downtown Westfield. We're more than a gym. We're a cause.
Support for the community programming of WSKB is provided by the Dunkin' Donut Shops of Westfield and the Sardinia family. It's nice to know that even as the world changes, Dunkin' Coffee remains the same at 7 convenient locations throughout Westfield.
We thank the generosity of our underwriters. For more information, please contact the Westfield State Foundation at 413-572-8646.
Thursday morning from 6 till 8, it's Patrick Berry, owner of the Westfield News Group.
Community Radio.
89.5 WSKB.
Live from the campus of Westfield State University, this is 89.5 FM, WSKB, Westfield.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Mark Auerbach. This is Artsbeat Radio here on 89.5 FM WSKB. Peter Coles is our engineer this morning, and we are chatting with the composer Stephen Schoenberg, who has a prolific career writing not only as a performer, but as a composer. And currently, before we went to the break, was talking about Dear Edvard, which will be workshopped on Martha's Vineyard over Labor Day weekend. Later on in the program, we'll be talking with another composer, Alexander Savronsky, whose work can currently be seen on stage in Sister Mary Ignatius Explains It All for you at the Berkshire Theater Group. Today's kind of an interesting day in the arts and entertainment scene in Western New England, because today the MGM Casino opens in downtown Springfield, and along with its opening comes the promise of a lot of entertainment, not only at the casino, but at the Mass Mutual Center and Springfield Symphony Hall and City Stage. And the big opening concert to kind of kick things off is Stevie Wonder. So we're going to see some bright lights and some bright names coming to Springfield thanks to MGM, and that all begins today. Stephen Schoenberg, you're collaborating with Richard Michelson, and one of the interesting things that I realized during our break is both of you have children who are noted composers. Richard Michelson's daughter has composed for theater. Your son has composed for orchestras, and one of his works will be performed at the gala opening of the Springfield Symphony later in September. What's it like having a kid who's a composer? And I know the two of you collaborate. Is his work very different from yours, or is there a lot of similarities you see?
Well, that's a great question. There are similarities only because he grew up, listening to me, and he also is a great improviser. But he's I don't even know what to say. He's an incredible son, a really good friend, and he's just an astounding composer. His music is his music, it's who he is. It's very eclectic. You just have to hear it. I'm very proud, obviously, of him. And I'd be proud of him with whatever he did, including my daughter. It's as a composer, it's great because we have a lot to talk about with each other, and just go over scores. And we collaborated, as I said, on the film. It's fantastic, to be able to have a relationship above being, a father. And, of course, as we get older, I was very, and even with my mom, we became friends at a certain point. So it's really fantastic.
He's going to come.
Interestingly enough, let me just go back to what you said. I actually grew up in Springfield, but when I was 15, my parents moved to Longmeadow, and that's where I met my wife, Jane. And we are also collaborators. We collaborate on a lot of kids' stuff, and many years ago wrote a book that has songs teaching kids about their body called My Body Works. And right now we're actually pitching to networks an animated series for kids. So she's also a great collaborator of mine. But really, mostly in kids' music, though we did write one beautiful choral piece for a graduation at your alma mater, Northfield Mount Herman, many years ago. So, yeah.
I mean, your son's going to be on Artsbeat Radio in September when we do a 1 hour show launching the 75th season of the Springfield Symphony, and we'll get a chance to talk with him about what influenced his music. But your music was influenced by other people. As you were growing up, were there either artists or composers that influenced you, and when did that you would listen to and say, I want to write like that person, or I want to write in the spirit of that person?
That my musical sense was always very eclectic. As I said, I grew up, just started to improvise on the piano when I was 2 years old, and so improvisation, there were a lot of influences. When I started studying classical music, I was, I think, 7 years old. I was really influenced by Beethoven and Schubert and Chopin and Bach. And then when I got a little older and I first heard Stravinsky, that totally blew my mind. And just the orchestration that he did, it sort of made me feel a bit, like, oh my gosh, can I even do that? And so I studied a lot of scores. But when I was 12, I was introduced to Muddy Waters. And hearing the blues for the first time, that just really took me into a whole different area. And so I would just say I'm really... I think we all are influenced by everything we hear, including hip-hop now. I love that Kendrick Lamar got the Pulitzer Prize this year, and I know that's very controversial, but there's just so much music right now that's changing and having an effect on so many people. So, my music is basically it's always been pretty lyrical, though I can definitely get, as I said before, quite atonal and a little experimental. But I think I'm influenced by everything I hear, including just, walking outside. I live really in a very rural area. There's a lot of sounds and... I don't know if that answers it, but...
Yeah, do you listen to music a lot? When you're not composing or you're not arranging or performing, do you listen to music? Is it on in the car? Is it on at home? Or are you one of these musicians who likes to just hear natural sound and quiet?
Well, I definitely like quiet, that's for sure. But I do listen to music always when I'm in the car, because that's when I get to hear all different types of music that's out there. The classical music scene, it's a very difficult scene. There's FCR and other programs, and there's not a lot of contemporary music being performed on these stations, which is really a shame. And there's jazz programs, and some of them are just, we can only play traditional jazz, and so you don't have a lot of the contemporary jazz artists that are performing, really unique stuff that's out there. It's a very interesting thing. How can you hear new stuff? You have to really find the stations that play it. A lot of online stations. Sometimes when I'm just done doing a lot of music, I'll just sit down, go online, and just listen to. That's how I listened to Kendrick Lamar's new album. I just went online. I wanted to hear what that was. I'd heard something on the radio before he was even nominated. But yeah, so I think it's really search and find. But I'm not listening to music all the time because, quite honestly, after a day of writing, my brain is pretty tired, and I'd rather just sit down somewhere, have a nice meal, maybe watch a movie, just chill out.
Stephen Schoenberg, thanks for joining us this morning. If you're on the Vineyard over Labor Day weekend, you can catch Dear Edvard. Otherwise, go to his website. It's stephenschoenberg.com. We'll be back after a break with Alexander Savronsky. You're listening to Artsbeat Radio here on 89.5 FM WSKB. I'm Mark Auerbach with Peter Coles. Don't go away.
Support for the community programming of WSKB is provided by Westfield Bank. For more than 160 years, Westfield Bank has been an important community presence and commercial leader in the Pioneer Valley. With convenient full banking services in Westfield, West Springfield, East Longmeadow, Agawam, Feeding Hills, Springfield, Southwick, as well as Enfield and Granby, Connecticut, visit us on the web at westfieldbank.org. We thank the generosity of our underwriters. For more information, please contact the Westfield State Foundation at 413-572-8646.
He rules the roost on Thursday from 6 till 10. It's Patrick Berry.
Community Radio.
89.5 WSKB. Live from the campus of Westfield State University, this is 89.5 FM WSKB Westfield.
Welcome back to Artsbeat Radio. This is Mark Auerbach with Peter Coles in the studio at 89.5 FM WSKB. The music in the background is written by Alexander Savronsky. That you want to remember, because Alexander Savronsky is composing for some of the best theater going on in Western New England. I first got a chance, or the first time I was made aware of his music was at a production of A Midsummer Night Dream at Hartford Stage a couple of seasons ago. And Alexander not only composed the music for the Shakespearean play, but performed in it as well. And in this particular production, directed by Darko Tresnik, who is, as artistic director of Hartford Stage, brought A Gentleman's Guide to Love and Murder and Anastasia to Broadway. He used a lot of musical theater people in this particular production of A Midsummer's Night Dream. So the music was performed by a lot of Broadway voices, and it was fascinating. You've also, if you've been attending theater in the area, heard Alexander Savronsky's scores at Wham Theater for The Last Wife, and the current production of Sister Mary Ignatius Explains It All for You at Berkshire Theater Group, and The Cake at Barrington Stage. And upcoming, you'll hear music that he provides for the Glass Menagerie, which is the fall production at Barrington Stage, and he's working right now on a production in New York. So I'm really excited to have him on the phone with us this morning. Good morning, Alexander.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I know that you're a real busy guy right now, and that I just saw the stuff that you did for Sister Mary Ignatius and the Actor's Nightmare at Berkshire Theater, but you're working on a production with Glenn Close right now in New York. Tell us about that.
It's this really wonderful play called The Mother of the Maid by Jane Anderson, who is a Emmy Award-winning writer. She wrote the TV show Olive Kittredge for HBO a while back. She's really quite astounding. And we did a world premiere of this play at Shakespeare and Company a couple seasons ago, where I've done about, well over a dozen productions with them as an actor and also as a composer and sound designer. So Matthew Penn, the director of Mother of the Maid at the Public, and I both worked on the original production of Mother of the Maid at Shakespeare and Company. And then Matthew and Jane, the writer, continued workshopping the production with readings in various places. And we're just really thrilled that Oscar Eustis and the Public Theater have decided to move forward with it as part of their fall season. And with Glenn Close at the helm, it's an absolute treat. It's really quite astounding. And the play is about Joan of Arc, and it's basically the story of Joan of Arc through the eyes of her mother. And Joan is a character in the play, but the main focus of the play is her parents, and watching really the human side of what happens when your daughter tells you that she's hearing voices and that she's going to go off to war and go and start dressing like a man in the 1400s in France, and how you support a child that is doing things that maybe you don't necessarily agree with, understand, or even have any sense of, or can't even verify with them, like talking to saints and all. So it's a pretty beautiful piece of theater, and it tracks everything from Joan's first experience with St. Catherine through the end of her life, and it's really, really quite beautiful.
Now you've worked on the production before, and it's being revised and all that. Is your score and the music you've written? Are you taking what you started with and working on it, or are you kind of going back and doing a complete fresh take?
Well, the way I think about music a lot for different scores, when I approach a production, is kind of like the first step is developing a palette. Kind of like an artist that's assembling the different colors they want to use. You don't have every single color that you own necessarily laid out on a table in front of you and you paint with that. You have a sense of like what type of tones you want to start working with. And similarly, musically, I work a very similar way. I kind of assemble my musical palette and kind of start messing around with those. So I think we're going to be using the similar palette, musically speaking, in terms of like sound and different instruments and things like that I did in the original production. But the actual music itself is all going to be original and new to the production, because everything changes when the set changes and the costumes change, and especially the cast changes and the space changes. Also, the script has gone through a number of changes as well. There's been some substantial cuts. We even lost an entire character, I think, certainly for the to make the play a little bit more pointed in the direction that the playwright wants to go. So we're telling, of course, the same story, but certainly in a different way. So I think the music being the means to support the emotional journey of that story and take the audience on that ride. Since the ride has shifted a bit, so to speak, the music is going to have to shift a bit too.
You are a performer, an actor, a musician, as well as a composer. When did you start composing?
I think I've been composing since I was a kid. Actually, I started playing violin when I was 3 years old, classical violin, Suzuki method, when I grew up in New York, and from a very early age, that approach is a lot about ear training. You're hearing something and then you mimic it on the violin. So I think I got very used to playing by ear, and then also the next step is playing what I hear in my head, not necessarily stuff that's coming at me externally. So I think I've just kind of always been messing around with music. From a pretty young age, I wrote music when I was in elementary school, like for little school projects and things like that. But the first show I professionally designed music for, I think, was I may be getting this wrong. I know that I worked on music for a lot of shows as an assistant composer, or as writing a little piece here or there, kind of adding to the mix. But one of the first, it's not the first show I wrote on my own, one of the most substantially important shows to me that I wrote on my own was a production of Dangerous Liaisons that Tina Packer directed 8 years ago, but in 2010 at Shakespeare and Company. And I wrote a full original score with a string quintet that I wrote and also performed and recorded entirely on my own. And that was like one of the first times that I really started thinking about how all the different instruments that I play can kind of contribute to me writing music, but I can kind of do it as a one-man band as opposed to writing for other people to play. So that kind of opened up a world of possibility for me, and also started me on a much more serious journey of learning a lot of instruments. And right now I try to make it a little hobby that every show that I work on, with, of course, some exceptions, but generally speaking, every show that I work on, I try to find an instrument or a skill or a tool or something that I'm using that is a bit out of my comfort zone, so that I'm always in that mental headspace of, well, I don't know how this works, let's find out together, It helps me not only expand my musical palette, but also I kind of like being a little bit uncomfortable, Does that make sense?
It does. I have a question. Now, the first time, that I became aware of your work was seeing A Midsummer Night's Dream at Hartford Stage. But then,
thank you.
I saw The Cake earlier this year at Barrington Stage, which really left an impact on me, not only because of the subject matter and Deborah Jo Rupp's performance, but your music really leapt out. And at that point afterwards, I went back and I read your bio in the playbill, and then I connected with one of my colleagues at Hartford Stage, and I said, who is this guy? He's worked for you. He's really doing interesting and different stuff. And she gave me your website, and I started listening to snippets of the other things that you had composed. But in a case like The Cake, you were not involved in the production of it when it originated in L.A. And how much time did you have to compose it for Barrington Stage? And, did you go to the script first? Did you get to see a production of it before you went and started composing it? How did it evolve?
Well, I was not involved in the original production out in L.A. I don't believe any of our designers were, or our cast, apart from the director, Jennifer Chambers, and our leading actress, Deborah Jo Rupp, and also, obviously, the playwright, Becca Brunstetter. Everyone else on the production cast and crew is completely new. So it's a completely new production, and they stressed that when when we were doing meetings for that production, the director kept on saying, "Look, I know we've done this play before, but I'm interested in finding what this production is going to be, that we're taking it from scratch. And we have storytelling information that we know works, but I'm not interested in recreating anything that we did previously." And one of the things, having seen the play that I'm sure you're aware of, is that in the script, and it always starts with the script, the script is your Bible. I come from a world of classical theater with Shakespeare and Marlowe, and that's my background, and that's all of my master's degrees and all that kind of stuff everything's in Shakespeare. So that's when I approach a text, it's very much with the same reverence that I would approach a classical text, where like everything you need to know about the play starts and ends with the text. Sure, the director and you might have other ideas, but it has to all be supported by the text. That's really what you come back to and you always check in with is the text. So in the text, Deborah Jo's character, Della, is going to be a contestant on the Great American Baking Show, which in the show is a spin-off of the Great British Baking Show, which is a real TV show. So we did a lot of research listening to music from those types of shows, that show in specific, and also other cooking shows that kind of we thought were on a similar level with that one.
Okay.
And so that was all pre-production. That was all like weeks before the rehearsals even start. And then when the rehearsal started, I was in the room with the actors trying some stuff out, but basically I wrote the score as we went. I had a couple ideas and sketches. I kind of assembled my palette as I do before the first rehearsal. But as far as all the music that the audience hears in the final production of the play, that was all created in the time span that the actors are rehearsing the play, which is about 3 or 4 weeks. So, and all of it was created with the intent of trying to emulate, and it's all original music. I didn't use anyone else's score, but it's all original music created to try to emulate or kind of lift a bit of the feeling from some of those TV show themes. Does that make sense?
It does. Now, when you work with Shakespeare, for example, like Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare knew music and often wrote in his scripts lyrics, and his scripts, there was lots of rhyming and things like that you could take and bounce music from, because he believed I can't say he actually believed, but it appears that he did, that music was a big part of his comedies like Midsummer Night's Dream and some of the others. When you look at a contemporary show, or you look at an upcoming classic that you're working on, The Glass Menagerie, the playwrights did not necessarily envision music as part of it. Where do you find the music in the show? Is it in the script? Is it in the characters? Or is it a combination of that?
Well, actually, in point of fact, in Tennessee Williams' The Glass Menagerie, there's a couple different versions of it, and in all of them, in one of the early versions, and I think the subsequent versions as well, Tennessee Williams is pretty specific about his musical choices, actually. He actually indicates in Tom's opening monologue, there's a line that says, "And that explains the fiddle in the wings." implying that there's like a violin or some type of string instrument playing off stage. So some of the playwrights actually write it in, like, and even Arthur Miller in Death of a Salesman writes in that Willie's theme is played on a flute, I think, or his brother's theme. One of the characters has a theme on the flute. There's also trumpet indicated. So some playwrights go to some pretty lovely lengths to kind of help you out. However, when they don't, that's, I think, when it's kind of like setting down a piece of paper in front of a kid that is, then they're just saying, just color it in, and they give you all these crayons, and you can just color in the picture that's there, or it's a completely blank piece of paper. Like, either way, it's going to be a really interesting journey. It's just a question of what you're starting with. So sometimes the playwrights are not specific, and that's when it becomes the job of the director and the music director or the music composer or the sound designer, whoever it may be, to kind of take the lead on that. And generally speaking, the period of the play has a lot to do with it. If the period of the play is instrumental in understanding the play itself, then unless someone in the design world, in sets or lighting or costumes, is doing something to actively pull the play out of that period, then generally speaking, the music is going to want to support the other design choices, if that makes sense. So, like when I did the production of Dangerous Liaisons, they were very interested in keeping it in the period, which is just before the French Revolution, I think, if I remember correctly. So all the music was created original, but to that style and with those types of instruments of the period. So we weren't using electric guitar, for instance. But when I'm doing a production like Midsummer at Hartford Stage, which is obviously classical text, but as well it's been updated to the 20th century, to the early 20th century, then I have other things to pull on. And that score had some piano, which was an instrument that was not available to Shakespeare. Shakespeare would have had harpsichords and virginals and other types of keyboard instruments, but certainly not a piano just yet. So it's interesting that you can kind of mix and match. When I did a score recently for a production of The Last Wife at Wham Theater, it's a play that kind of exists between two worlds of a classical play taking place during the reign of Henry VIII and then also contemporary. So we were able to mix a couple different types of instruments to kind of mix periods. But I find it fascinating because you can get so many different palettes assembled of musical ideas and musical language that can really help you create some really interesting stuff.
Now, I was very aware of the fact that you were involved in Sister Mary Ignatius because I saw it last week and I was prepping for the show. And I noticed that there was house music, which was playing before the show started. Was that?
Oh, sure, yeah. Pre-show music.
Yeah. And people were talking and all that before the show, but there were some people that were actually picking up on the music in being played. And was that part of, were those songs your choices, or did your work start when the curtain went up?
No, on that particular production, and I would say on most any production that you see, if there's a composer listed, they're generally doing any original music. And if there's a sound designer listed, they're generally the ones that are doing a lot of other found music and things like that. So my work on that production was both as composer and sound designer. So my work encompassed anything that comes out of the speakers or anything that comes out of the actors' mouths that might be inherently musical. So we decided that since the Actor's Nightmare, the first play of the evening, the first moment of it starts with the actor being thrust into this production of, I guess a very weird production of Noel Coward's Private Lives. I started there, and I started looking into the music of Noel Coward. And it was if you're not familiar with it, anyone that's listening, it's a treasure trove of wonderful things, especially for musical theater performers that are looking for fun songs to put in their books that people at auditions may not know as much. Noel Coward is a great place. The text that he writes and the music that he writes is just absolutely wonderful and so much fun. And it's just, oh my goodness, I'm so surprised that I wasn't as familiar as I now am with a lot of his work. It's just beautiful. So the pre-show in Sister Mary and Actor's Nightmare at Berkshire Theater Group was a combination of some Noel Coward tunes of Noel Coward himself singing and playing his own tunes in some cases, and also one of my favorite performers of the 40s, Danny Kaye, doing a lot of covers of his stuff. Because both of them had a lot of similarly like witty and very clever lyrics written by Danny Kaye's wife, Sylvia Fine, in a lot of cases. So I just found them both to kind of complement each other beautifully, and that just kind of had a nice way to set the tone of this.
I see this.
Into, you know?
I see the similarity between Noel Coward and Danny Kaye. It's something that dawned on me not only in seeing Sister Mary and listening to some of the music beforehand, but also it just happened that in my car I have all kinds of show tunes and CDs, and I was listening to a recording of Lady in the Dark, driving around, and Danny Kaye singing this song called Tchaikovsky, which was kind of like a rambling of all of these Russian composers that just tripped off his tongue effortlessly. And I thought, how could anybody do that? And then you hear Noel Coward singing his kind of witty and effervescent lyrics, and they just trip off of his tongue. It's a skill and an art.
Yeah, it's called a patter song, and it's actually something that even predates both of them. It's something that I first became very aware of in a lot of Gilbert and Sullivan. There's if you're familiar with Gilbert and Sullivan's work, like the Policeman song, the Major General, in Iolanthe, I believe it is, When You're Lying Awake with a Dismal Headache, there's that one. And there's a lot of really great patter songs throughout their canon as well. And actually, Danny Kaye made a recording with the D'Oylio Cart Opera Company of him doing a bunch of covers of Gilbert and Sullivan songs, and a lot of them happened to be the patter songs, just because that's what Danny was really, one of his many, many skills was fast talking.
Who are some of the theatrical composers or classical composers that have influenced you?
Well, I grew up in a classical household with like opera and a lot of classical music, and go to the theater a lot. So I think I'm influenced a lot by a lot of different things. I'm trying to think there's a composer that I listen to more often than others. In the classical world, I'm sure it's a very healthy mix of a lot of the greats, Tchaikovsky and a lot of the great Russian composers actually are ones that I always connected to. I like the big, bold cinematic music, kind of like Gustav Holst and things like that. And I also really connected a lot with the operas of Wagner, like the Ring Cycle and things like that, just because it was so epic. I grew up on like operas like La Boheme and things like that, and suddenly here were the gods and goddesses of Valhalla battling it out in the middle of an opera stage, and that was pretty exciting. So the epic quality of that, I'm sure, kind of prepared me for some of Shakespeare's epic stories as well. But I will say, as far as contemporary composers, there's a couple sound designers that I've always revered, that I've been lucky enough to become friends with in my field, and one of them in particular is John Gramada, who's a multi-award-winning composer and sound designer, and easily one of my favorite contemporary composers working today. And I wound up connecting with John just because I heard his work year after year after year on Broadway, and finally got bold enough to send him an email and say, look, I'm just a young kid. I'm a really big fan of yours. I'd love to pick your brain. And he was kind enough to have a really long phone chat with me, and then we eventually became really good friends, and we've worked together on a number of productions together, actually. But his music especially is really astounding. I really quite like it. So there's always people to draw from, both from your past and also just right around the corner and right all around you. It's a pretty wonderful time for me to be a composer, just because there's so many people that are working that I admire that I also get to work with. So it's a really fun collaborative art at times, and also a lot of times it can be very solitary, just because as a composer I'm the only one, generally speaking, unless I'm working with someone else, which is a little more rare.
Do you compose in a studio? Do you compose at home? Where do you actually go to work to compose, or how does it happen?
I think it happens the same way any creative person kind of does it, which is, if you're that kind of a person that just needs to create, then you're going to create regardless of where you're at. It happens when I'm in the car. It happens when I'm in a rehearsal studio. It happens when I'm sure asleep at night. I think it's the kind of thing where that's just one of the ways my brain works is I experience things, and when I think about the emotion of what I experienced, it comes out as music. And I think that's really what composition for theater is you're playing the silences, you're playing what's being said between the lines, you're playing the emotion of the scene, or you're the emotion of what is about to happen before the scene starts. So you're leading the audience into something or taking them out of it. So I think for me, it's hard to kind of separate, this is when I'm working and this is when I'm not. And although I do have a studio at home, it's one of the reasons why I moved to the Berkshires to begin with, is to have the space to be able to have my own little music studio, and it serves me well. But I would say a majority of my work that I do is done in a rehearsal room with the actors, trying stuff out in the moment, because I'm also an improv performer. I also do a lot of musical improvisation. So I like working in the room with actors and being able to like grab an instrument, bring it to a rehearsal, and try some stuff out. And we see if that works, if that fits. And I think that tends to be a lot quicker too, and also so much more informative for me to be able to try something in the room live. And if it doesn't work, let's try something else, as opposed to, taking a few hours to record something, send it in, have them try it in rehearsal, get a note that night, send something else the next day. Instead of taking a few days to work on a choice or two.
Now,
in a matter of minutes.
Yeah.
So I like being in the room, and kind of a lot of my music tends to come out of improvisation and then layering on top of that and kind of building from that.
You do a lot of work in Western Massachusetts and Northern Connecticut, in all of the theaters there, and you're up here in the Berkshires now. What drew you to the Berkshires? There seem to be so many people in the creative industries, whether they're writers or filmmakers or composers, that have chosen to live in Western New England. What was it that brought you here?
Well, I started working at Shakespeare and Company as a young actor when I was training at one of their training programs when I was an undergrad in 2003. And that was the first time I ever came to the Berkshires. And I absolutely fell in love with the company, with the founding artistic director, Tina Packer, who's become a really dear friend and mentor. And the idea of not ever coming back to that area was just impossible. So every summer after that, I would come up either to see shows or to do other training and things like that. So when I started in New York after I graduated my undergrad about 13, 14 years ago, I started in New York, did a bunch of shows there, and Tina came down and wound up seeing a show that I was working on at the Public, my first show at the Public about 11 years ago. And she said, I remember you. You trained with us many years ago. And I said, yes, I did. And she said, you're also an actor-musician, aren't you? I said, yes, I am. And she said, well, we're doing a production of All's Well That Ends Well that we're going to be turning into a play with a lot of live music, composed and music directed by Bill Barclay, who is now the music director at the Globe Theatre in the UK, in London. And she said, we'd love to have you a part of it. And I said, sure. And that was the summer of 2008, I believe, or the summer of 2007, and she was talking about the next year. So the following summer, I went up there, and I stayed there for about 7 years, on and off at Shakespeare and Company, and then started getting work in the surrounding areas, like Hartford Stage and things like that, working up in Vermont, working at the other theaters in the Berkshires. It's just kind of been this beautiful community of just such vibrant theater artists and such really vibrant and vital theater communities that are just doing wonderful work that very often transfers to New York and transfers other places, but also, even when it doesn't, it's some of the best work I get to do across the country. And I'm from the New York area. My family's now lives in Hartford. So being in the Berkshires is a really lovely spot where I'm never more than a few hours drive from any work that I'm doing, either in New York or Boston or anything like that, or even a few hours drive from family. So it's a really lovely central spot for me.
Well, before we run here, what are some of the upcoming projects you have? I know that you're working at the Public right now, and then the Glass Menagerie opens the fall season at Barrington Stage. Do you have stuff scheduled after that?
I'm right now in a lot of conversations to get a bunch of other stuff up and running for the rest of the year, but since it's still under contract and we're still kind of figuring that out, I'm not at liberty to say, but I will say right now the two shows that I'm working on feverishly at the moment are this Glass Menagerie that I'm doing at Barrington, where I'm writing all the music, And a great sound designer, Joel Abbott, is going to be doing the sound design for that. And then we're going to have a wonderful musician, Susan French, who's going to be providing the live music for the production as well that I'm writing on viola. And then for Mother of the Maid at the Public, that's going to be starting up in mid-September in performances, and it runs through the beginning of December, I believe, even though it may extend depending on how it's received. I know that it was already supposed to run through November, and it's already been extended due to a huge demand in ticket sales. So I will say, if someone's listening and wants to go check it out, sooner than later, because I don't know of how many tickets are going to be available even by the end of this phone call. It seems that they're selling more and more and more every day. I know that my own family was having a hard time finding a date they could go because of availability. So it's exciting to be in something that, we just started rehearsals for that a few days ago, and already the reception for it in New York is crazy impressive. So it's going to be lovely to walk out there and know that there's full house every single night. But a good way to keep in touch with and up to date on all my work is I have a website, which is just my name, alexandersavransky.com. Very easy. And I always try to keep that very up to date with all the things that are happening and ways that you can see my music or see me perform or see me playing with bands and things like that. Because I also, as a musician, still gig out and play around with other bands, stuff like that. So that's a pretty good way to keep in touch if anyone listening is interested in kind of getting the updates as the other projects get solidified. But, yeah.
Alexander, thanks for joining us this morning, and I hope you'll come back and talk with us again at some point over the course of the next season, because we want to know how you felt the work at the Public and the Glass Menagerie went.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, if you're able to come check it out, let me know. We'd love to chat with you more about it again.
Okay, take care. Thanks for joining us today on Artsbeat Radio here on 89.5 FM WSKB. I'm Mark Auerbach with Peter Coles in the studio. Next week, we're going to preview Hartford Stage's upcoming season. We'll be talking with Elizabeth Williamson, the Associate Artistic Director, about the upcoming season, and with Jackson Gay, who's directing the world premiere of Make Believe, which opens the season in September. We're going to leave you this morning with Alexander Savransky's music for Homebody, the Tony Kushner play, which was performed at the Ancrem Opera House earlier this summer. Thanks for joining us. Have a great weekend.